The floors of Thornvale Citadel had seen 1,000 years of history beneath them, and for the past 3 years, Leora had scrubbed every inch of the marble corridors that weaved through the fortress like pale veins. Her knees had developed permanent indentations from kneeling, deep grooves in the flesh that would never fully soften, and her hands had grown raw, despite the salve she rubbed into them each night. The work was endless, repetitive, and utterly invisible, much like the woman performing it. Every morning before dawn broke across the eastern mountains, she rose from the cramped servant quarters and made her way through the torch-lit passages, her wooden bucket filled with water and crushed lemon that burned her cracked skin, her brush worn down to stubbled bristles. The gray linen dress she wore had faded to the color of ash. On it, and the rope belt tied at her waist held together more than just fabric. It held together the invisible threads of a life no one acknowledged. The morning routine was always the same, a ritualistic descent into pain and numbness. Leora would wake before the other servants, when the servant quarters were still thick with darkness, and the sound of other women's breathing echoed in the cramped space. The pallets were thin, stuffed with straw that had long ago compacted into something like stone, and her shoulders ached from the previous day's labor. She would rise carefully, trying not to disturb the others, and make her way in the dark to the water trough in the corner. The water was ice cold, drawn from the deep well beneath the castle, and it would make her gasp as she splashed it on her face and hands. That small shock of cold was the only thing that made her feel truly awake. Dressing was a study in deliberation. She had 2 dresses, the one she wore and the one she washed once a week in the scullery. Both had been gray once, perhaps, before the dyes had faded from repeated scrubbing and sweat. She pulled the fabric on carefully, wincing as it caught on the raw patches of skin on her shoulders, where the rope of the bucket's handle wore against her. The dress hung loose on her frame. She had been thinner when she first arrived at Thornvale, and she had never quite regained the weight. There was never enough food. A chunk of bread in the morning, thin broth at midday, and another chunk of bread with cheese if the kitchens were generous. Her ribs were visible if she looked in the rare moments she had to herself. The work itself was a meditation in solitude. She would make her way to the lower corridors, the ones where fewer people walked, and begin her endless scrubbing. The lye soap in the bucket burned her hands, and she had learned to ignore the sensation the way one learns to ignore constant noise. The stone floors were cold and unforgiving, and the weight of her body pressing down through her knees sent sharp points of pain that radiated up her thighs. She worked in silence, moving her worn brush in methodical strokes, watching the dirty water turn gray-brown as she scrubbed. The smell of wet stone, of lemon and lye, of the castle itself had become so familiar that she no longer consciously registered it. It was simply the smell of her life. What Leora knew about Thornvale had been learned through observation, through the countless hours spent moving silently through its halls, while others walked right past her without truly seeing. She knew that the great hall faced east, and that afternoon light would flood through its windows around the 3rd hour, painting the stone tiles gold before fading again. She knew the Alpha King took his morning walk through the western wing corridor precisely when the bells chimed 6 times, his heavy boots echoing in perfect rhythm, his black cloak sweeping behind him like a shadow given form. She knew his mood by the set of his shoulders, by whether his hand rested on the hilt of his sword or hung loose at his side. She knew these things the way one knows the pattern of rain or the turning of seasons, through patient, wordless observation. The Alpha King's name was Cale Thornwood, and he had ruled the North for 5 years, with a firmness that commanded respect and a weariness that suggested the weight of crowns was heavier than any could truly understand. At 28 years old, he carried himself with the bearing of someone far older, his steel gray eyes holding secrets that seemed to shift to molten amber when moonlight touched them, or so the gossip in the servant quarters claimed. He was tall enough to fill doorways, broad enough to block out light. His muscular frame, swathed in black leather armor, marked with the silver wolf crest that symbolized his line. That scar running from his left temple to his jaw spoke of battles, of losses, of a life lived at the edge of conflict. Yet for all his presence, for all the way the entire citadel seemed to orient itself around him, he had never once looked down at the girl scrubbing his floors. She was furniture to him, scenery, less than the torch on the wall. This was how Leora had become invisible, not through any magic, but through the simple mathematics of power and perspective. When you were nothing, a servant girl with no family, no name, no history worth remembering, you became part of the architecture. You were as unremarkable as a stone pillar, as expected as a torch on a wall. The Alpha King walked past her 3 times a week through the corridors she maintained, and she would press herself smaller against the wall, chin down, fingers busy with her brush, making herself even less than she already was. She had perfected the art of being overlooked so thoroughly that it had become second nature. Her eyes, which were a bright green with flecks of gold that might have been beautiful in another life, were always cast downward. Her voice, which could have carried strength, was kept to whispers when she had to speak at all. Her earliest memories were fog, thick, impenetrable fog that obscured everything before the age of 12. That was when the traders had found her wandering the border forests, delirious and half-starved, her clothes torn and her mind blank. No one had come searching for her. No family emerged from the darkness of her forgotten past. The traders had sold her to the citadel's steward within a week, and the steward had put her to work the day she arrived. In the 10 years since, no one had asked her name before assigning one. No one had wondered where she came from. Leora was the name given to her by a tired steward consulting a ledger, the name of the last girl who had run away, and thus the name of the girl who might replace her. It was not truly hers, but it was all she had. Sometimes she tried to remember who she had been before the fog, but those memories remained tantalizingly out of reach, like reaching for something in water. What she also had, though she kept it hidden beneath her dress where no one would see, was a birthmark. It lay on her left shoulder blade, dark as a shadow, a crescent moon with 3 stars arranged in an arc beneath it. She had discovered it by accident one night, her hand reaching around to scratch an itch, and her fingers had found the raised pattern of scar tissue or birthmark. She was not entirely certain which. The shape was too perfect to be random, too specific in its symbolism to be meaningless. Crescent moons meant something, she suspected. Stars arranged in patterns meant something, but meaning belonged to people with pasts, and she had traded hers for invisibility long ago. So she kept her shoulders covered, wore her dresses high-necked and modest, and told herself that the mark meant nothing. It was just an accident of her skin, a random pattern that held no significance. Life in the servant quarters was a particular kind of punishment reserved for those with no alternatives. The room she shared with 7 other women was cold and windowless, the pallets thin and rotted in places, the air perpetually damp with the smell of unwashed bodies and mold. The work began before dawn and ended after dusk, I leaving just enough time for a meager supper of bread and broth before exhaustion dragged her into sleep. Her dreams, when she had them, were fragments of something else, a place with white stone and green mountains, a woman's voice singing in a language she didn't consciously understand. But morning always came, and with it, the pain and the dreams dissolved like mist. There were no days of rest, no time when her hands were not engaged in labor. Yet within this gray routine, Leora had found something that might generously be called contentment, or at least the absence of active suffering. The routines were predictable. The work was solitary. No one bothered her if she did not draw attention to herself. Then came the day that changed everything, though at first it arrived wearing the mundane disguise of an ordinary morning. The weather was cold, the kind of cold that made her fingers go numb, even in the scrubbing water, and she had woken with a particular ache in her lower back that suggested rain was coming. The bells had chimed for the hour when Leora heard the commotion in the higher corridors, not unusual during trading season or when visiting nobility arrived. She paid it little mind, continuing her work on the lower floors, moving her brush in methodical strokes across marble that had been cleaned 1,000 times before. It was one of the other servants, a girl named Marta, who worked in the kitchens, who brought the news down to the servants' hall during the midday break. A delegation from the Eastern Pack, Marta announced, her voice breathless with the excitement of bearing news. They've come seeking alliance. The elder himself is here. Must be important. I saw them from the kitchen window, riding through the gates on horses finer than anything I've ever seen. Their armor has these silver crescent moons on it. Beautiful work. The Alpha King is hosting them for a feast tonight in the Great Hall. A proper feast with multiple courses and wine from the southern vineyards. We're going to be working all night. The information rippled through the servants' hall, causing a stir of heightened activity and whispered speculation. By nightfall, every corner of the citadel would need to be immaculate. The great hall would require special attention. Floors swept and washed, windows cleaned so the glass gleamed, torches replenished with fresh oil and set at precise intervals. The long tables would need linens that had been stored in the cedar chests, the silver polished until it gleamed like captured starlight, the candles trimmed so they burned evenly. It was work that could be managed, nothing beyond the scope of their capabilities. Yet the mere presence of guests elevated everything into significance. When nobles or warriors visited, even servants became part of the pageantry, if only as scenery. The stepsister, a woman named Kessa, who held a position slightly higher than Leora's, having worked in the kitchens for 5 years before being moved to general service, appeared in the servants' quarters with assignments. She was cruel in the particular way that people without real power often are, taking out her frustrations on those even lower than herself. When she reached Leora's section of the room, her mouth twisted in a smile that held no warmth. "You," she said, pointing directly at Leora. "You're to help with the Great Hall tonight. Get those floors absolutely pristine, and don't you dare leave any streaks or marks. The Citadel's honor depends on it." She lowered her voice, leaning in close. "Though I suppose someone like you wouldn't know anything about honor, would you? Just do your work and try not to embarrass us." Leora had long since learned not to respond to Kessa's cruelty. She simply nodded and continued with her current task. But she felt a familiar flush of shame that she could never quite suppress. She was used to being invisible, but there was a difference between invisibility and active disdain. The former was neutral. The latter suggested she had somehow failed at her most basic task, which was to be utterly unremarkable. Leora finished her morning tasks in the servant quarters and made her way to the great hall, anticipating that her evening would be spent polishing or arranging something, anything that would fill the hours before she could return to sleep. What she did not anticipate was the portrait that hung in the great hall, placed in a position of prominence near the raised dais where the Alpha King held court during formal functions. She had been to the great hall countless times, but the portrait was new, positioned so that anyone entering from the main corridor would see it first. The painting was extraordinary, rendered in oils with remarkable detail, every brushstroke an act of reverence. It depicted a young woman, no more than 18 or 19, with hair of dark auburn copper falling in waves past her shoulders. Her face was delicate, is marked by a strong jawline and bright, intelligent eyes that seemed to look directly out of the canvas. The artist had captured something vital in those eyes, a spark of life, of strength, of secrets. The woman in the painting wore a dress of emerald silk that shimmered even in the painted form, and there, painted in exquisite detail on her collarbone, just visible above the neckline, was a mark, a crescent moon with 3 stars. Leora froze. The sensation that struck her was not gradual. It came as a physical blow, as if someone had reached into her chest and seized her heart. The breath left her lungs. The brush fell from her hands, clattering on the stone floor with a sound like thunder. Every part of her had gone cold except for the spot on her shoulder blade beneath her dress, where the birthmark seemed to pulse with a heat that couldn't possibly be real. She stood transfixed before the portrait, unable to move, unable to look away, her mind racing with sensations and thoughts that tangled together into something she couldn't name. The woman in the painting had her hair, her eyes, her face, the same sharp cheekbones, the same curve to her jawline, the same expression that suggested strength, held carefully in check. It was like looking at a mirror, into a past she didn't remember, a reflection of someone she should have been in another life. Her hand rose unbidden, her fingers tracing the air in front of the portrait as if she might touch the woman's face and find it warm. "The lost princess of the Eastern Pack," came a voice from behind her, cutting through the fog of her shock. "Killed in the coup when she was barely 12 years old, a tragedy that shaped the entire history of her people." Leora turned to see an older man, thin-framed and austere, dressed in dark robes embroidered with silver threads that caught the light. His hair was gray, slicked back from a high forehead with some kind of oil that made it gleam unpleasantly. and his pale, watery eyes held something that made her skin prickle with instinctive warning. This was the elder, she realized, the visiting dignitary from the Eastern Pack. He stood before her with his carved wooden staff held loosely in one hand, and there was something about his posture that suggested he was not accustomed to being refused anything. A terrible tragedy, the elder continued, studying her with an intensity that made her want to shrink away. His eyes moved over her face with surgical precision, cataloging features as if she were a specimen of particular interest. She was to be the greatest ruler of her generation, powerful, wise beyond her years, marked by the old bloodlines with the ancient gift. When the coup came, she was lost in the fires that consumed the royal palace. Her body was never found, but we must assume he trailed off, his eyes still fixed on her with an unsettling focus that made her want to flee. There was a calculation in his gaze, a weighing of options that suggested danger. "Yes, sir," Leora whispered, finding her voice, though it sounded small and fragile, even to her own ears. "A terrible tragedy. I'm very sorry for your loss. I should return to my work." She tried to step away, but something in his expression stopped her. He raised one hand, a subtle gesture that nonetheless commanded obedience. "Wait, you have not answered my question." I haven't heard a question, sir," she said carefully. The elder smiled, and it was the smile of a predator that has located prey. A perceptive observation. "Tell me, girl, do you have a birthmark?" The question hung in the air like a blade suspended above her neck. She could lie. She could walk away. She could make herself small and insignificant as she had been trained to do. Instead, something inside her seemed to crack, as if a wall she had built without knowing its purpose was beginning to crumble. Her throat felt tight, and she found her hand rising unbidden to her neckline. "Only a small scar," she said, and it was close enough to truth that it carried no weight of a lie. "From my childhood, I think. I don't remember. I was found as a child, and I don't recall anything clearly before that time." The elder's expression shifted, something flickering across his features too quickly for her to name. Fear, perhaps, or rage. His hand gripped his staff so tightly that his knuckles blanched white, and she could see the muscles of his jaw tensing. "What is your name?" "Leora, sir. I'm a servant here." She watched as a terrible knowledge seemed to crystallize behind his eyes. He stared at her for a long moment, his breathing seeming to accelerate. When he finally spoke again, his voice was controlled, but there was an edge of violence beneath the calm. "Where do you come from, child?" "I don't know, sir. I was found as a child in the border forests, brought here as a girl. I have no past that I can remember. The traders who found me, they knew nothing of where I came from or who I was meant to be." The elder's mouth thinned into a line of pure rage, though his voice remained calm, controlled, which somehow made it far more terrifying than if he had shouted. "Resume your work, and girl, do not speak of that birthmark to anyone. Understand? To anyone at all. It would be dangerous for you, very dangerous indeed." Leora understood nothing except that she had stumbled into something far larger than herself, something that had already begun to pull her under like a current in deep water. She bowed, returned to her work, and tried to make herself as invisible as she had always been. But invisibility, once lost, is nearly impossible to reclaim. She felt the weight of his gaze on her as she moved through the great hall. Wynne felt his presence like pressure in her chest, even when she was not looking directly at him. Something about her had triggered a recognition in him, a danger that emanated from deep knowledge. And the most terrifying part was that she did not understand what she had done, what she represented, what threat her simple existence posed to this man. The feast that night would have been magnificent if the undercurrents of tension had not made everything cold and fraught with hidden meanings. The great tables had been laden with foods that Leora would have found unimaginable just hours before: roasted pheasants with herbs from the southern gardens, fresh bread still steaming from the ovens, aged cheeses and candied fruits, wines that must have cost more than she earned in a year. The scent filled the great hall, rich and complex, and Leora could feel her mouth watering with hunger even as she worked. The Alpha King presided over the long tables, his presence a force that seemed to press down on everyone in the hall. He was in his formal black leather armor, the silver wolf crest gleaming on his chest, his black fur-lined cloak draped across the back of his chair. The visiting delegation of Eastern Pack warriors sat at his right hand, distinguished by the silver crescent moon emblems on their armor, symbols that matched the mark on the portrait, that matched the mark hidden beneath Leora's dress. She moved through the hall with her pitcher of wine, pouring carefully from table to table, keeping her eyes low, aware that the elder watched her whenever he thought she wasn't noticing. His pale eyes followed her movements like a hawk tracking a hare. The woman she had learned was the stepsister, Kessa, that cruel attendant from the servants' quarters, also watched her with new intensity, as if trying to decode a puzzle. There was something almost hungry in her expression, as if she sensed that something important was about to happen and wanted to be positioned to take advantage of it. Midway through the second course, during a moment of heightened activity, when the servants were moving in constant motion to clear plates and bring new dishes, Leora felt a sharp shove against her shoulder. She stumbled, and the pitcher of wine slipped from her hands, its contents cascading across the table directly toward the elder. The purple liquid stained his immaculate robes, soaking into the silver embroidery that marked his station. But there was no accident in that shove. She could feel it in the deliberateness of the contact. Someone had pushed her intentionally, and she turned to see Kessa moving quickly away, her expression innocent. The elder's hand shot out, with serpent-quick reflexes, grabbing her wrist with a grip that sent bolts of pain shooting up her arm. His fingers were thin, but remarkably strong, crushing the delicate bones beneath her skin. He pulled her forward violently, his pale eyes blazing with fury that had nothing to do with spilled wine, his voice a hiss that only she could hear. "Clumsy little beast. You did that on purpose. You're testing to see who will protect you." He yanked her sleeve upward with sudden violence, bearing her arm in front of the entire hall. The motion exposed more than he intended. The fabric tore beneath his violent grip, the old cloth shredding like paper. And there, just below her shoulder, visible in the firelight for all to see, was the birthmark, a perfect crescent moon with 3 stars arranged like a constellation beneath it. The mark was dark, almost black, and it seemed to pulse with its own inner light in the dancing flames of the torches. The effect was instantaneous and total. Every warrior of the Eastern Pack rose from their table as one. The motion synchronized with a precision that suggested military training. Every single man, without exception, dropped to one knee in perfect unison. The sound was like thunder rolling through the great hall, heavy armor hitting stone in perfect synchronization, the reverberations echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Gasps erupted from the assembled company. Servants scattered and fled, terrified by the sudden reversal of normal hierarchy. The Alpha King rose slowly from his seat, his hand on his sword, his eyes blazing with that amber gold light that spoke of his wolf pressing forward, demanding answers. The temperature of the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Explain," he said, his voice like grinding stone, fixing the elder with a look that promised violence if the answer was insufficient. The elder's composure cracked like ice in spring. His hand was still gripping Leora's arm, and she could feel him trembling with a rage that had nothing to do with the spilled wine. "It's a fraud," he snarled, desperation leaking through the cracks in his controlled facade. "Some coincidence of resemblance. This servant is nothing, no one. To claim the mark is true," said one of the Eastern warriors, his voice deep and resonant with emotion. He was a large man with battle scars visible on his weathered face, and tears were streaming down his cheeks. "My princess, we have mourned you these 10 years. The fire was supposed to have taken you. We were told your body was found among the ashes. We were told to rebuild without you, to forge ahead as if the heart of our people had not been ripped out. But we always knew something was wrong. The elder insisted too hard that you were dead, insisted that we accept it without proof. We were told." "You were told lies," came a voice from the shadows at the edge of the hall, and a figure emerged, Kessa, her face flushed with adrenaline and triumph. "Told lies by all of us who kept her hidden because no one questioned what she was worth when she had nothing. A servant girl, powerless and alone. But now that the mark is seen, now that the truth reveals itself, she will finally claim what she never deserved. I pushed her deliberately so the elder would expose her. I wanted the truth to come out. And now I'll finally get recognition for helping, for knowing all along something was different about her." Leora felt her mind fracturing, reality bending into shapes she couldn't understand. This couldn't be real. She was a servant. She had always been a servant. The portrait was a coincidence, a cruel trick of resemblance, nothing more. 3 years of invisible work couldn't be undone by a birthmark. And yet, the moonlight struck through the tall windows of the great hall, bathing the chamber in silver radiance. The light was clear and pure, the rays crystallizing in the humid air of the crowded hall, and it touched her exposed skin directly. The birthmark began to glow with an otherworldly luminescence that seemed to come from within the mark itself, from within her very blood. The light was cool and ancient and fundamentally true, and it was undeniable. Every eye in the hall was fixed on that glow, watching as the mark pulsed with power. Leora gasped, her vision blurring. Something inside her was awakening, something that had slept for 10 long years, something that predated her earliest memories in the fog. She felt as if her skin was too small for her body, as if her bones were being remade, as if something vast and primal was clawing its way up from the deepest part of her soul. The pain was exquisite and overwhelming, a sensation like being torn apart from the inside out. It started in her shoulder blade, where the birthmark blazed, and it radiated outward through her entire body every nerve singing with agony and electricity. But accompanying the pain was a sensation like fragments of memory coalescing into meaning, like a dam breaking and flooding back 10 years of stolen life. She saw flashes, a woman with hair of copper and emerald silk holding her small hand, teaching her words in a language she didn't know she still remembered. The woman's face was kind but stern, and her eyes were the same bright green as Leora's own. A palace of white stone beneath the eastern mountains, sprawling across a plateau with towers that touched the clouds, sunlight on marble, the smell of mountain flowers, the sound of people moving with purpose and pride, fire and screaming, and hands pulling at her, carrying her away into darkness, running, always running. The forest close around her like a prison, her small legs carrying her deeper into the wild, voices calling her name, a name that wasn't Leora, a name that felt powerful and full of meaning. Her body convulsed with the force of the transformation. Her dress tore as her body changed, the seams splitting under the pressure of expanding muscle and reshaping bone. Her back arched, her spine restructuring itself, her skin beginning to ripple as fur emerged. The pain was so intense that she would have screamed if she could have, but her vocal cords were transforming, shifting into a form that belonged to a creature of shadow and silver. The servants screamed and fled, pressing themselves against the walls in terror as they watched a woman transform into something not quite human. The warriors of the Eastern Pack watched in awe as a wolf emerged, rare, magnificent, unlike any normal transformation. Her fur was silver, like moonlight, so pale it was almost white, shot through with threads of gold that seemed to hold the light itself. Her eyes were green as spring forests, with gold-flecked irises that were distinctly, unmistakably hers. She was larger than a normal wolf, her body suggesting the ancestry of ancient bloodlines. But more than that, there was something ethereal about her form. She seemed to be made of moonlight itself, and when she moved, it was with a grace and power that made it clear she was no wild beast, but something far more significant. The reaction of the Great Hall was one of pure, unadulterated chaos that somehow contained its own terrible beauty. The Eastern warriors, finding who had already fallen to their knees at the sight of the birthmark, pressed their foreheads to the stone in complete submission, tears streaming down their weathered faces. They were weeping, not from fear, but from a profound and ancient grief finally transmuting into hope. These were warriors who had carried the weight of a 10-year lie, who had been told their beloved princess was dead and gone, and now they were witnessing her rebirth before their eyes. Their shoulders shook with the force of their emotion, and their voices rose in a harmonious keening that was both lamentation and rejoicing, a sound that had not been heard in the halls of the northern fortress in perhaps all of recorded time. The Western Pack nobles, by contrast, staggered backward in shock, their fine clothes suddenly seeming inadequate to their confusion. They had come expecting a simple feast, a negotiation of trade or alliance, and instead they were witnessing the revelation of a long-buried truth that would reshape the political landscape of all the territories. Their gasps and exclamations filled the air like a flock of startled birds, their faces pale beneath their finery, their hands reaching for weapons that would be useless against what they were seeing. The servants, those who had not already fled in terror, had pressed themselves against the walls, making themselves small, their eyes wide and uncomprehending. Some of them had known Leora, or thought they had worked alongside her for years, while she scrubbed and carried and labored in silence. The impossibility of what they were witnessing seemed to break something in their understanding of the world's natural order. The stepsister, Kessa, had stumbled backward, her face draining of all color, as she watched the girl she had tormented transform into something magnificent and terrifying. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her hands trembling, her triumph turning to ash as she realized the magnitude of what she had precipitated with her cruelty and her desperate manipulation. She had wanted to be remembered for revealing the secret, but instead she had revealed only her own malice, her own hunger for recognition that could never come. The elder himself, his face twisted with a rage so complete that it seemed to consume him entirely, had fallen backward as if pushed by an invisible hand. His pale eyes, the eyes of a man who had built an entire existence on lies and corruption, were filled with a terror so profound that it seemed to unmake him. He had believed his secrets buried. He had believed the girl was safely obscured beneath her position as a servant, powerless and voiceless. He had built his entire regency on the certainty of her death, had told himself the stories he had fabricated so many times that they had become his truth. But now the truth was standing before him in a form that could not be denied, and with it came the absolute certainty that everything he had built would crumble to dust. The Alpha King had drawn his sword, but he did not raise it against her. Instead, he lowered it slowly, the blade pointing downward in a gesture of submission. His eyes, now fully amber gold, his own wolf barely held at bay beneath his skin, pressing against his human form with barely contained force, met her wolf's gaze with an intensity that transcended the moment. Something passed between them in that meeting of eyes, something that Leora could not yet name, but felt with every part of her being. The bond, ancient and unbreakable, that tied fated mates together across lifetimes. It was recognition on a level deeper than blood, a knowing that existed outside of reason or explanation. The elder, seeing that his hidden truth was unraveling before him, made a desperate move. He raised his staff, ancient magic crackling at its tip, dark magic drawn from forbidden sources, magic that corrupted rather than healed. The crackling sound filled the great hall, and the air seemed to darken. He directed it toward Leora, a spell designed to bind her, to cage her, to unmake what she had just become. The magic was a terrible thing, visible as black lightning that tore through the air like something alive and hungry. The Alpha King moved. His transformation was swift and terrible and beautiful. One moment he was a man, the next he was a wolf, black as the space between stars, larger than normal wolves by a measure that suggested ancient bloodlines, his eyes blazing like captured suns. He was a creature of power and majesty, and he moved with the speed of lightning. He interposed himself between the elder's spell and Leora, taking the blast of dark magic on his own body, absorbing the corruption that had been meant for her. The impact threw him across the hall, but he landed on his feet, shaking himself as if shaking off water. Around him, his own elite guard began their transformations, creating a wall of protection between the throne and the threat. The sound was tremendous, the cracking of bones, the tearing of armor, the cries of men becoming beasts. Within seconds, there were 6 massive wolves, all standing between the elder and the princess, all ready to protect her with their lives. The elder was subdued quickly, his staff shattered and scattered across the floor by the force of his own magic rebounding off the Alpha King's body. His power, whatever dark reserves he had drawn upon, suddenly severed and inaccessible. He was bound by warriors who moved with practiced efficiency, restraining him without violence, while other guards searched his person and his quarters. It was there that they found the documents, letters in his own handwriting, describing the orchestration of the coup, the meticulous planning of how to kill the royal family, the false reports of the princess's death in the flames. Years of embezzlement followed, of wealth siphoned from the Eastern Pact's coffers into his own accounts, of political power consolidated through fear and lies, proof of betrayal and murder on a scale that demanded justice. By dawn, Leora had been given a private chamber in the royal wing, a room with windows that faced east toward the mountains of her birth, though she could not remember them. She had been clothed in garments befitting her station, soft fabrics that did not burn or abrade her skin, and provided with servants to tend her needs. Her transformation had stabilized, and she had learned to shift back into her human form, though the experience was still disorienting, like waking from a long fever. Her human body was slightly different than it had been before, stronger, seemed more graceful, moving, with a confidence that had never belonged to the servant girl who had scrubbed floors. The muscles in her arms were more defined, her bearing more regal. Her skin seemed to glow with health and power. The gray linen dress was gone, replaced with clothes befitting her station, though her station was still uncertain, still being defined by those who now surrounded her. The first true morning after her awakening arrived with sunlight instead of the pre-dawn darkness that had always greeted her before. Real sunlight, not torchlight or the pale gray illumination that came seeping into the servant quarters before the sun properly rose. This was golden and warm, flooding through the tall windows of the royal chamber in a way that made her squint against its brightness. Leora woke to find herself in a bed, a real bed, not a thin pallet stuffed with straw, but a proper feather bed with linens so fine they felt like clouds beneath her skin. Her hands, which had been raw and cracked and scarred just yesterday, were now smooth and unblemished, the raw patches healed by the transformative magic of her awakening. She could feel the softness of the sheets against her palms without the pain that had always accompanied touch, and the simple sensation brought tears to her eyes. She lay there for a long moment, just breathing, just feeling the weight of a real mattress supporting her body instead of the unforgiving stone floor she had spent 3 years kneeling upon. When she rose from the bed, she caught her reflection in a mirror, the first full-length mirror she had ever truly studied herself in. The woman who looked back at her was a stranger wearing a familiar face. Her skin glowed with health, her eyes were bright with a light that hadn't been there before, and her body moved with a grace and power that spoke of her true heritage. The gray linen dress was replaced with a gown of deep emerald silk, embroidered with silver thread in patterns that represented the crescent moon and stars of her bloodline. The fabric hung perfectly, tailored to her form, and when she moved, it whispered against her legs like a living thing. She had servants now, 2 young women who had been assigned to her, and they appeared almost immediately when she rose, offering her water, offering her breakfast, offering her assistance with her hair. She had never had water heated specifically for her. She had never been offered food before her labor was completed rather than after. She had never had anyone touch her hair with gentle fingers, brushing out the tangles carefully rather than roughly. One of the servants, older than the other, wept quietly while working the brush through Leora's auburn copper locks. Leora made her way through the castle in the morning light, and everything was different. The corridors she had scrubbed for 3 years looked the same, and yet entirely changed. The marble floors gleamed as they always had. They gleamed because of her work, because of her endless hours of labor. But now, instead of walking past her unseeing, people bowed. They genuinely bowed, their heads dipping in a gesture of respect and obeisance. Warriors stepped aside to let her pass, their eyes cast downward in deference. Other servants whispered to each other, pointing, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. She was no longer the invisible girl moving through the halls. She was the princess, the one they had all walked past without truly seeing, and now her presence commanded attention and respect. The contrast was so stark that it was almost painful. Just yesterday, she had been pressed against this very wall, trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear entirely. Now people were actively attempting to get out of her way, as if her presence was too significant to occupy the same space. She passed Kessa in one of the corridors, and the stepsister's face went pale. She curtsied, actually curtsied, the gesture jerky and uncomfortable, her eyes red from weeping. Leora could see the fear in her face, the understanding that the girl she had tormented was now untouchable, unreachable, beyond her ability to ever hurt again. The fragments of memory that had emerged during her transformation had continued returning throughout the night, filling in the 10-year gap of fog like water finding all the cracks. She remembered her mother's face, a woman with the same green eyes and auburn hair, beautiful and strong, and worn down by the weight of leadership. She remembered the nursery where she had slept beneath a ceiling painted with constellations, the exact positions of the stars, marked with silver leaf that gleamed in the firelight. She remembered lessons in history and politics, the weight of responsibility that had been hers from birth, the pressure to become a queen worthy of her bloodline. She remembered her father, and a man tall and imposing, his voice deep as thunder, teaching her to shift under the light of the full moon. She remembered festivals and celebrations, the taste of honey wine and roasted venison, the sound of music played on instruments she had seen only in these returning memories. She was the lost princess of the Eastern Pack, the true heir to a throne that had been usurped. But memory was not the same as knowledge, and awareness of who she had been did not fully explain who she was now. The Alpha King came to her as the afternoon light was turning golden across the mountains. He knocked on her door with a formality that seemed absurd, given that his wolf had merged with hers in the deepest level of understanding just hours earlier. When she opened the door, he stood there in his armor, in his severity, and she understood that this was also part of who he was, the man who led not through cruelty, but through the weight of his own expectations. He had been up all night, she could see, dealing with the aftermath of the elders' exposure and the political implications of the princess's return. There was an exhaustion in his eyes that spoke of the burden of leadership. The Eastern Pack warriors have requested permission to take you home, he said without preamble, as if they had been in the middle of a conversation. To restore you to your throne, to rebuild what was lost. It is their right as your people, and it is your birthright as the princess heir. The warriors have been waiting for this moment for 10 long years. Leora felt something crack inside her chest. The windows behind her showed the mountains she had begun to remember, and she felt called to them in a way that was almost physical, and yet, "And do you want me to go?" For a long moment, he was silent. His amber eyes, not fully wolf now, but not entirely human either, caught somewhere between the two forms, searched her face as if trying to read something written in a language only he understood. She could see the conflict in him, the tension between what he wanted and what he believed was right. What I want is irrelevant to what must be done. You are a princess. They are your people. Their claim supersedes any other consideration. You have a throne waiting, a kingdom that mourned your loss, a responsibility that is yours by birth and blood. That's not what I asked, she said quietly. I asked what you want. He moved closer, and she could smell the leather of his armor, the smoke of the fires he had walked through in the past night, the scent of his wolf beneath his skin, that wild, dangerous scent that had drawn her even when she didn't understand why. The bond between us, what you felt, what your wolf felt when it awakened, it marks us as fated mates. That is rarer than any crown, more precious than any throne. In all of recorded history, perhaps only a handful of pairs have experienced what we felt in that moment. But to bind yourself to the north, to bind yourself to me, when your people are calling you home, that would be a choice that requires you to abandon your own future, your own destiny. Your pack lost you once. I cannot ask you to abandon them again for the sake of my own desires. I abandoned my future when I was a child and didn't remember having one, she said. I spent 10 years making myself less than human so I could survive in a place where I didn't belong. What I choose now is what matters. That's what freedom means, having choices. She reached up and traced her fingers along the scar on his jaw, feeling the pulse of his life beneath his skin, the drumbeat of his heart that matched her own in perfect synchronization. It was like playing a duet with someone whose music you had always known, even before you learned the notes. I was invisible for 10 years. I scrubbed your floors and watched you pass without seeing me. I was a ghost of a girl with no past and no future. And now you're telling me I have to choose between the home I don't remember and the man I've always felt drawn to without understanding why? The answer is no. No, he asked, confusion flickering across his features. No, I don't accept that choice. I'm not going to be separated from you, and I'm not going to abandon my people. There's a third option. He moved closer, his hand reaching up to mirror her own, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheekbone with a tenderness that suggested he was afraid she might disappear. What third option? I return to the Eastern Pack. I claim my throne and learn who I was meant to be. But I do it with you at my side. You travel with me. You help me rebuild what was lost. And when you need to return to the north, I return with you. We don't live separated by mountains. We build a future together, a partnership between the Northern Territories and the Eastern Pack. We unite our people not through arranged marriage or political necessity, but because we choose to. Because our wolves chose each other, and we're choosing to honor that. The relief and joy that flooded across his features was immediate and overwhelming, visible in the way his shoulders seemed to drop their burden, the way his amber eyes brightened. He pulled her close, and she fit against him perfectly, as if her body had always known the shape of his, as if the universe had been patient in bringing them together across 10 years of waiting. The embrace was tender and fierce at once, protective and equal. When he held her, she felt not like a princess being held by a king, but like two people who had been lost and had finally found their way home. "You'll be a great queen," he whispered into her hair, and she could hear the absolute certainty in his voice. "Greater than any the Eastern Pack has known. You have the power of the ancient bloodlines, the wisdom of a girl who was forced to survive impossible circumstances, and the compassion to understand suffering. We'll be great rulers," she corrected gently, pulling back just enough to look into his face. "Because when I return to my throne, I'm not leaving you behind. And when you return to yours, I'm not becoming a distant queen in another kingdom. We'll build something across the mountains, something that unites both our people, not because destiny demands it, not because of the bond between our wolves, but because we choose it together. Every single day, we choose each other and our people." And as the moonlight rose over Thornvale Citadel that night, painting everything in silver and shadow, Leora Ashvane stood in the arms of the man she was fated to love and understood, finally, what it meant to be seen, not as a servant, not as an invisible girl scrubbing floors, not as a ghost from a forgotten past, but as herself, powerful, worthy, meant for so much more than the life that had been assigned to her. The crescent moon birthmark on her shoulder blade glowed soft and true beneath the moonlight, visible now without shame or fear, a symbol of who she had always been underneath the invisibility. It was not a curse or a random mark, but an announcement of her identity, a claim to power and purpose that had been hers all along. The elder was taken in chains to face judgment in the Eastern Pack, where he would answer for the coup and the murder of the royal family. The throne that had been lost would be restored, and the people who had been ruled by a tyrant in false regent's clothing would finally know the truth about what had happened to their beloved princess. The lies would be unraveled, and justice would be served. And Leora, who had spent 3 years scrubbed raw and invisible, would step into her power as both princess and partner to the Alpha King, building a future that no one could have predicted when she was just another nameless servant girl moving silently through marble halls. She had been overlooked. She had been ignored. She had been made to believe herself less than worthless, unworthy of notice or attention. For 10 years, she had made herself smaller and smaller until she was almost nothing at all. But the moon knew her name. The blood remembered her. The throne had been waiting all along, patient and true. And love, true, faded, equal love, had finally seen her clearly for the first time, recognizing her not just as a mate, but as an equal, a partner, a future queen who would rule with wisdom and compassion alongside her king. In her story, we find our own, the reminder that invisibility is not the same as worthlessness, that silence does not erase identity, that the most powerful transformations often come not through magic alone, but through the simple act of being truly, finally seen by someone who matters. Leora's journey from servant to princess is not merely a tale of destiny revealed, but a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the power of love that recognizes your true worth when the world has tried to convince you that you have none. She teaches us that we are all more than what others perceive us to be, that our value is not determined by our circumstances or our status, and that sometimes the greatest magic of all is finding someone or finding yourself who can see your light even when you've been hidden in darkness for far too long.